Purses made willing spenders, and generous impulses were untrammeled. Nothing could be more gratifying or touching than the respect shown by those homeless men to the pioneer women and children. They would walk long distances and suffer delays and inconveniences for the privilege of passing a few hours under home influences, and were ever ready to contribute towards pleasures in which all might participate. There were so few young girls in the community, and their presence was so greatly desired, that in the early winter Georgia and I attended as welcome guests some of the social gatherings which began at early candlelight, and we wore the little white dresses that were so precious in our eyes. Before the season was half over, heavy rain was followed by such bitter cold that all the ground and still waters were frozen stiff. Although we were well muffled, and grandma warmed us up with a drink of hot water and sweetened cream before starting us out after the cows, the frost nipped at our feet until the old scars became so angry and painful that we could scarcely hobble about the house. Many remedies were tried to no purpose, the most severe being the early foot bath with floats of ice in the water. It chilled us through and through, and also made grandma keep us from the fire, lest the heat should undo the benefit expected from the cold. So, while we sat with shivering forms and chattering teeth, looking across the room at the blazing logs under the breakfast pots and kettles, our string of cows was coming home in care of a new driver. We were glad to be together, even in misery, and, all things considered, were perhaps as useful in our crippled condition as before, for there was enough to keep our hands busy while our feet rested. Grandma thought she made our work lighter by bringing it to us, yet she came too often for it to seem easy to us. First, the 6 brass candlesticks with hoods, snuffers, and trays had to be brightened, and next there were the small brass kettles in which she boiled the milk for coffee to be polished inside and out. However, we did not dread the kettles much, unless burned, for there was always a spoon in the bottom to help gather the scrapings, of which we were very fond. But when she would come with a large pan of dried beans or peas to be picked over quickly, so she could get them soaked for early cooking, we would measure its contents with critical eyes to make sure that it was not more than we had had the previous day. By the time we would get to the bottom of the pan, she would be ready to put before us a discouraging pile of iron knives, forks, and pewter spoons to scour with wood ashes. How we did hate those old black knives and forks! She said her sight was poor, but she could always see when we slighted any. The redeeming work of the day was sorting the dried fruit for sauce or pies. We could take little nibbles as we handled it, and knew that we should get an extra taste when it was ready for use. And after she had put the upper crust on the pies, she would generally permit us to make the fancy print around the edges with a fork, and then prick a figure in the center to let the steam escape while baking. Sometimes she received $1 apiece for these pies, and she had so many customers for them, and for such loaves of bread as she could spare, that she often declared the farm was as good as a gold mine. We were supposed not to play with dolls. Consequently, we durst not ask anyone to step around and see how our little house in the backyard was weathering the storms, nor how the beloved 9 in it were getting along. Though only bottles of different sizes, to us they were dear children, named after great personages whom the soldiers had taught us to honor. The most distinguished had cork stoppers for heads, with faces marked on the sides. The rest, only wads of paper or cloth fastened on the ends of sticks that reached down into the bodies. A strip of cloth tied around each neck below the bulge served as make-believe arms, suitable for all ordinary purposes, and, with a little assistance, capable of saluting an officer or waving to a comrade. We worried because they were clothed in fragments of cloth and paper too thin for the season, and the very first chance we got, we slipped out and found our darlings in a pitiable plight. Generals Washington and Jackson and little Van Buren were mired at the foot of a landslide from the overhanging bank. Taylor, Webster, Clay, and Benton had been knocked down and buried almost out of sight. Martha Washington's white shawl and the chicken plumes in her hat were ruined, and Dandy Jim from North Carolina lay at her feet with a broken neck. Such a shock! Not until we realized that everything could be restored was our grief assuaged, that is, everything but Dandy Jim. He was a serious loss, for he was our only black bottle, and had always been kept to wait on Martha Washington. We worked fast, and had accomplished so much before being called into the house that we might have put everything in order next day, had Georgia not waked up toward morning with a severe cold, and had grandma not found out how she caught it. The outcome was that our treasures were taken to the storeroom to become medicine and vinegar bottles, and we mourned like birds robbed of their young. New duties were opened to me as soon as I could wear my shoes, and by the time Georgia was out again, I was a busy little dairymaid and quite at home in the corrals. I had been decorated with the regulation salt bag, which hung close to my left side like a fisherman's basket. I owned a quart cup and could milk with either hand, also knew how to administer the pinch of salt which each cow expected. After a little practice I became able to do all the stripping. In some cases it amounted to not more than half a pint from each animal. However, much or little, the strippings were of importance and were kept separate, because grandma considered them good as cream in the cheese kettle. When I could sit on the one-legged stool which Jakey had made me, hold a pail between my knees, and milk one or more cows without help, they both praised my cleverness. A cleverness which fixed more outside responsibilities upon me and kept me from Georgia a longer while each day. My work was hard, still I remained noticeably taller and stronger than she, who was assigned to lighter household duties. I felt I had no reason to complain of my tasks, because everybody about me was busy and the work had to be done. If I was more helpful than my little sister, I was also a source of greater trouble, for I wore out my clothes faster, and they were difficult to replace, especially shoes. There was but one shoemaker in town, and he was kept so busy that he took a generous measure of children's feet, and then allowed a size more, to guard against the shoes being too small by the time he should get them finished. When my little stogies began to leak, he shook his head thoughtfully and declared that he had so many orders for men's boots that he could not possibly work for women or children until those orders were filled. Consequently, grandma kept her eye on my shoes, and as they got worse and worse, she became sorely perplexed. She would not let me go barefooted because she was afraid of snags and ensuing lockjaw. She could not loan me her own because she was saving them for special occasions, and wearing instead the heavy sabots that she had brought from her native land. She tried the effect of continually reminding me to pick my way and save my shoes, which made life miserable for us both. Finally, she upbraided me harshly for a playful run across the yard with courage, and I lost my temper and grumbled. "I would rather go barefoot and get snags in my feet than have so much bother about old shoes that are worn out and no good anyway." I was still crying when Hendrik, a roly-poly Hollander, came along and asked the cause of my distress. Grandma told him that I was out of humor because she was trying to keep shoes on my feet while I was determined to run them off. He laughed, bade me cheer up, sang the rollicking sailor song with which he used to drive away storms at sea, then showed me a hole in the heel of the dogskin boots he wore, and told me that out of their tops he would make me a beautiful pair of shoes. No clouds darkened my sky the morning that Hendrik came, wearing a pair of new cowhide boots that squeaked as though singing crickets were between the heavy soles, for he had his workbox and the dogskins under his arm, and we took seats under the oak tree, where he laid out his tools and went to work without more ado. He had brought a piece of tanned cowhide for the soles of my shoes, an awl, a sailor's thimble, needles, coarse thread, a ball of wax, and a sharp knife. The hair on the inside of the boot legs was thick and smooth, and the colors showed that one of the skins had been taken from the body of a black and white dog, and the other from that of a tawny brindle. As Hendrik modeled and sewed, he told me a wondrous tale of the great North Polar Sea, where he had gone in a whaling vessel, and had stayed all winter among the mountains of ice and snow. There his boots had worn out, so he had bought these skins from queer little people there, who lived in snow huts, and instead of horses and oxen, used dogs to draw their sleds. I liked the black and white skin better than the brindle, so he cut that for the right foot, and told me always to make it start first. And when I put the shoes on, they felt so soft and warm that I knew I could never forget Hendrik's generosity and kindness. The longer I wore them, the more I became attached to them, and the better I understood the story he had told me. For in my musings they were not shoes, but Spot and Brindle, live Eskimo dogs that had drawn families of queer little people in sleds over the frozen sea, and had always been